Hi, now for something completely different. This is something I was working on a month ago, but then Mali happened and I got distracted by Mali. You know the results. I've done a series of videos about the conflict in Mali and what's going on. But I want to get back to this before everybody forgets about it. And that is in April 2026, the German government issued something referred to as a German military strategy. And now, to be clear, they have not published military strategy. That is classified. But they did publish something called the Gezamtkonzeption der Verteidigung, which is like the general concept of defense. And it's a very, very interesting document. And among other things, it says something very stark. It says, Russia is likely to remain the greatest threat to our security. Maybe this seems like it's a no-brainer to you, but from a point of view of German military policy, this is actually a really big deal. Hi, if you're new here, my name is Michael Shirkin, and welcome to my YouTube channel, Pax Americana. It's a conversation about world affairs, global conflict, military strategy, and anything else that happens to be in my mind. As usual, if you like this content, please hit like and subscribe. You may also hit the thanks button, send a little money my way. You can also become a channel member, which would make you one of the coolest people on the planet. And finally, also, you can buy me a coffee using the link in the description below. I'm very, very grateful. All this stuff really helps support my channel, helps enabling me to keep doing what I'm doing. It saves me from having to go work at Starbucks or something like that. I think this is more interesting than working at Starbucks. I'd like to think that you think so too, right? You'd rather Michael makes videos than Michael goes into work at Starbucks. The Germans call this text the Gezamtkonzeption der Verteidigung. So this is the overall concept of military defense. And it combines two things. So there are really two documents that are out there somewhere. There's the military strategy, and then what they call the Fähigkeitsprofil, or the capability profile, which is essentially the plan for building the military that the strategy requires. Now, to be very clear, the military strategy and the Fähigkeitsprofil are actually classified documents. Obviously, I don't have access to them. What I do have is a publicly released summary that is available on the internet, and that's what I downloaded and read. It's available in English and German, and it's intended to give citizens and allies and adversaries some idea of what the Germans are up to without giving away any of the actual details. Now, what I want to do is first I want to put this document in context by talking about how we got to where we are, and I think this is very important because the document is even more interesting if you compare the document to its immediate predecessors. So I'm going to look at three earlier documents. First is the 2013 document called the Neuausrichtung der Bundeswehr, the new realignment of the German military. And then in 2015, there was a brief, like a piece of analysis published by a German think tank called the Stiftung Wissenschaft und Politik, or SVP or SWP for us gringos. And it's not an official document, it's more just high-level Germans at a premier think tank thinking about, well, what should the next white paper, what should the next policy paper say? And then finally, we get to the 2016 white paper, which is the last of the three I want to look at. So it's a white paper on German security policy. And at the end of this journey, when we get to the 2026 document, or documents, plural, you find a Germany that sounds, strategically speaking, like a completely different country. So let me break this down. So part one, the documents. Part two, the threat, and I'm titling this section From Everything to Russia. Part three, the mission, From Expeditionary to Territorial. Part four, the ambition, Germany as a military leader. Part five, the nature of war, what Ukraine changed. And I've got timestamps in the description so that you can jump around from section to section and according to whatever interests you. Are you ready? Let's go. So part one, the documents. Now, actually, that's kind of a teaser, but really before we start, we need to be thinking about 9/11, or rather the end of the Cold War. After the end of the Cold War, the Germans, like everybody else in NATO, they're wondering, well, what do we do now? Like, what's the point of a military now? What kind of military do we need? And I think a lot of the NATO military sort of spun around in circles. They didn't really know. All they knew is they didn't need as large of a military as before, presumably, because they don't have to worry about the Warsaw Pact and the Soviet Union. But they need something. But what? Where's the threat? What are they going to do? What the Germans ended up doing is they ended up really embracing, particularly after 9/11, the idea of expeditionary warfare. The idea is that, all right, we don't really have to worry about territorial defense, defending Germany, defending their homeland from the Soviets or something. What we need to do is we need to worry about what's going on elsewhere in the world, and we need a military that's expeditionary. We can deploy it, right? So I believe with the Germans, it first started maybe in Kosovo. And then they started moving, particularly with 2014, a little bit more towards, well, I don't know, maybe not so fast. But let's jump in it with the 2013 document, though, and you can really kind of see what I'm talking about. So the 2013 document is something called the Neuausrichtung der Bundeswehr, the realignment of the Bundeswehr. The defense minister at the time is Thomas de Maizière. I don't know how Germans pronounce it. I pronounce these things like French, or Thomas de Maizière. Maybe it's a Huguenot name or something. Anyways, this document was at its core about organizational reform. The Germans tried to figure out how do they reorganize their military. It's shrinking. In 2011 they got rid of conscription. So it's a smaller force, but they need to redesign the force so that it still does what they needed to be able to do, which raises the question, what do they actually need to be able to do? And how to rejigger everything. And this is what they're thinking, and how to guide it basically as the force shrinks. Now, the framing of that document, I think, really tells you everything you need to know about the strategic world in which the Germans thought that they were living. The threats the document identifies are the following: failing and failed states, international terrorism, terrorist and dictatorial regimes, criminal networks, climate and environmental disasters, migration, shortages of natural resources, and epidemics. Oh, and also threats to critical infrastructure. You know what's not on this list? Russia. This is really the post-9/11 strategic imagination. The danger comes from the global south. The danger comes from ungoverned spaces. The danger comes from non-state actors, from the chaos it spills out of weak or collapsed states. So the Bundeswehr's mission now is to become deployable, to be able to send contingents somewhere to distant theaters to do peacekeeping, stabilization, counterinsurgency alongside allies. At this point, I believe already 340,000 German soldiers had served abroad in Afghanistan and Kosovo and Mali and the Horn of Africa. Next, we get to the SVP paper, the 2015, which is a policy brief by Mr. Lindenkamp and Mülling. The policy brief is interesting not because it's an official policy document. It is not an official policy document. It's an analytical commentary written by two researchers at Germany's premier security policy think tank, and it argues about what the Germans' forthcoming white paper should address. The argument put forth by the SVP is really blunt. It's really interesting, actually. It says, stop pretending that the external strategic environment is telling you what to do. It doesn't. I mean, for one thing, because 2015, there's still such little clarity about what are the major demand signals coming from the world, and it's still like they're not, Ukraine's happened, but it's not really a defining moment the way it is now. Well, I'll get to that. According to them, so it's not about the external strategic demand. It's not about the demand signal from the environment. It's rather Germany's defense capabilities determined by the constraints, domestic constraints. There are 5 internal challenges that, according to the authors of the SVP brief, should drive the white paper. Demographics, where will soldiers come from and after conscription is ended? Equipment, the Bundeswehr's gear is poorly maintained and new procurement is chronically delayed. Alliances, Germany can't go it alone. The role of the military, what's it actually for? And then resources, how do you actually pay for this thing? As for the Russia question, this did happen after 2014. So Crimea happened. The Ukraine war is already on. So it's present in the document, but really only obliquely. The authors warn against making sweeping strategic decisions in response to the crisis in Ukraine because the situation might look different by the time the white paper is finished. So they're counseling caution. In other words, they're saying, okay, Ukraine, Russia, yeah, this is a big deal, but it's not the defining organizing principle, or we shouldn't let it be the organizing principle for moving forward in terms of our defense planning, at least not yet. Then we get to the third document, which is the 2016 white paper. I refer to the white paper, not like the Weißbuch or anything like that, just because I happen to have read this in English. Some of these things I read in German, some I read in English. It all depends on, I don't know, frankly, on whatever the PDFs I found already on my hard drive, because I've written about this while I was at the RAND Corporation, and I've actually put links to my publications about the Germans in the description, as well as a link to a piece that I wrote about the Bundeswehr and the Zeitenwende, I'll get into that, for War in the Rocks. So you can read up some of this background on those things. All right, so 2016 white paper. It is a major strategic document. It's the first in a decade, and it was published under Defense Minister Ursula von der Leyen, who is now, she's like the head of the EU. and it was signed by Chancellor Angela Merkel. So it was that era. This is a genuine government-level document involving multiple ministries, allied consultations, and a broad public consultation process. It's comprehensive. It's deliberately comprehensive. The 2016 white paper lists 9 categories of security challenges without necessarily prioritizing amongst them: transnational terrorism, cyber threats, interstate conflict, fragile states, weapons of mass destruction proliferation, threats to supply lines, climate change, irregular migration, and pandemics. The point is, though, that this is a very sweeping view. This is a wide-angle lens here. No single threat dominates. Russia is mentioned in this document. The document acknowledges that borders have been redrawn by military force in Europe, so the Russians have sort of shattered a norm. It says also that the rules-based order is called into question, but Russia is not named as a military adversary. It's not identified as the primary threat. It's just one data point in a complex picture. So again, we're still kind of like spinning around in circles. What's the military for? What do we have to worry about, strategically speaking? The framing of the 2016 white paper thus is strategically pluralist. It's multivariable. That the threat is, Germany is threatened by multiple things at once, and the response has to be comprehensive. You need a civilian and military instrument working together. You need strong alliances, crisis prevention, partner capacity building. And the whole idea is casting Germany as a responsible stakeholder in a rule-governed international order. So it's being a good member of the international order. And that's kind of it. So this is our baseline, and I think this is going to help us really appreciate why the 2026 strategy and the capability profile documents are so interesting and so unique. Part 2, the threat from everything to Russia. The 2026 Gezamtkonzeption, which is the publicly available document, opens with a sentence that tells you immediately that something fundamental has shifted. It says, quote, Russia's openly revisionist policy aims at reversing the European security order and considers war a legitimate means to achieve this. This isn't Russia is a challenging actor or not. The rules-based order faces pressure, but rather, or not even, there are threats from states and non-state actors alike. But this is like, no, this is Russia. Russia's the problem. And there's a forward in the document from Defense Minister Pistorius who says explicitly, this document makes clear that in Europe, Russia is likely to remain the greatest threat to our security. Then it goes further. Russia has scaled up weapons production to prepare for a military confrontation with NATO. They're preparing. Now, again, compare this to the 9th category threat matrix that we saw in the 2016 white paper. That pluralistic approach, multi-priority, where if everything's a priority, nothing's a priority, all that's gone. The 2026 document does mention terrorism. It is relevant to NATO and NATO collective defense, but there's no list here. Instead, you've got a name, Russia. And the document is analytically specific about what the Russian threat actually consists of. And it breaks it down into 2 separate dimensions. The first is whole of government. Russia already operates below the threshold of war, what the document calls hybrid operations, targeting all the elements of Germany and allied states: espionage, sabotage, cyber attacks, disinformation campaigns. And these are described not as occasional incidents, but as permanent conditions. Second, in terms of military strategy, it says Russia exploits conflicts on its periphery and threatens Europe from all directions using long-range weapon systems. The document says that Russia is, quote, creating the conditions for a military attack on NATO countries. This phrase, creating the conditions for a military attack, it's not like diplomatic hedging. They're sort of saying, it's perhaps as close as you can get in a public document that says, we think they're planning to do it. Doesn't mean they will, but they're making preparations. And the document lays out Russia's strategic objective with unusual clarity. It says that Moscow wants to reverse the post-1991 European security architecture. The path to that goal runs through 2 steps. First, weaken internal cohesion in NATO. Second, decouple the United States from Europe. And if both succeed, NATO fails. And if NATO fails, Russia gets to redraw the map, not just in the Baltic, but in Poland and Hungary and in the former Warsaw Pact, all these countries that are now new NATO allies. One thing the document doesn't do, at least in the public version, is discuss China. It doesn't spend much time in it, and I don't think the word even occurs anywhere in this document. And I think it's because it's not that the Germans don't think China is irrelevant, but rather because perhaps It's just covered in the classified portions? I'm not sure. Who knows? Maybe it's safer to say it's just not germane to the focus of the document, which is ultimately trying to reorganize or use the menace of conventional warfare on the European continent as the organizing principle for the strategic planning of the Bundeswehr moving forward. Now that brings us to the mission. So part 3, the mission, from expeditionary to territorial. The clearest way to see the shift in mission and the thinking about the mission of the Bundeswehr is by comparing how the documents rank the Bundeswehr's tasks. In 2013, the Bundeswehr's tasks were listed as national collective defense. I mean, that sounds legit, but national collective defense, if you read the text carefully, it makes clear that it's like it's boilerplate. Of course, you've got to say that because you've got these treaties and alliances that are all about that. But then if you read further, it's very clear that the document's saying, yeah, well, officially that's our priority, but not really, because that's not realistic. So it's like we're going to throw that a bone. We have to say it, but that's not where the head is. Their thinking is about international crisis prevention and conflict management, including counterterrorism, EU security and defense missions, homeland security contributions, rescue and evacuation abroad, partnership and cooperation, and humanitarian assistance. So that's 7 different tasks. As it happens, as I said, this business about alliance and territorial defense, yeah, it's listed first, but that's not the priority. And in fact, the German army, the army that the Germans were building around this time, 2013, really was optimized for deployment in distant theaters to going to places like Afghanistan. The 2016 white paper maintained this broad task list while nudging collective defense back up the priority order post-Crimea. So it's more important. But still, it's talked about in terms of a comprehensive approach, the idea that military and civilian instruments need to work together across a wide spectrum of challenges, from counterterrorism to pandemic response. We're still not focused on conventional warfare. We're still not focused on fighting Russia. What we're seeing here is sort of hedging and caveating. Yeah, we need to include conventional military capabilities for dealing with adversaries like Russia, but truth be told, it's not really the priority. Now we get to the 2026 Gezamtkonzeption, which collapses all of this. And now there are 4 tasks. This document says plainly, the core task is the Bundeswehr's priority: conventional defense, territorial defense. That's the priority. The military strategy therefore primarily focuses on the threat posed by Russia. Actually, that's a quote. The other 3 tasks, crisis management and partner capacity building, defense, diplomacy, and homeland security, they're still there, but they're very explicitly made subordinate and secondary and tertiary in terms of where they fall out in the list of priorities. This is what Germany does when it's not preparing or engaged in the main event. That's what it's for, the main event, the big war. And everything else is like, well, that's nice, but not necessary. This is a complete inversion of the 2013 logic, when crisis management was the expected use case and territorial defense was simply a paper theory. It's just theoretical baseline. Now, the army is supposed to be, the military is supposed to design for big wars. That's the expected use case. And the crisis management is really the secondary mission. The document also includes a new concept that I did not find in the earlier texts, which is this idea of a one theater approach. The idea is that you have one Bundeswehr that has to be able to operate with a single set of forces, not separate pools for different missions, which is something that the Germans were tinkering with in the teens, the 20-teens, like having troops that were specialized for the sort of the heavy conventional stuff, but then the guys for the conventional, for the expeditionary stuff, basically with the focus on the lower end of the conflict spectrum. Now we have just one force. You can't just have an expeditionary force for Africa and a serious heavy force for Europe. It's just one. And it has to be able to generate strategic defense across all domains and theaters while keeping collective defense as the organizing priority. In concrete terms, this means that deployments to places like Mali or the Sahel, where the Germans were very active, now compete directly with the eastern flank with concern about Russia for the same soldiers and the same equipment, the same logistics. You don't have separate buckets. You just got one bucket. And we know which bucket is the priority. We know what the priority is. Similarly, during the 2010s, the Bundeswehr experimented with partial equipping strategies. The idea was that the entire army didn't need to be fully equipped. You just needed enough stuff so that you could fully equip specific units for being deployed for one purpose or another, with enough left over for others to train with. So here's the idea. If you're not expecting to go to war, big war, that means that you just need to be able to maintain a certain op-tempo of overseas deployments, which means at any given time, I don't remember if the German deployment cycle was 3 months or 4 months or something like that, but you need to be able to sort of send a brigade to Afghanistan for that period and sustain it. And the idea is that you need to be able to sustain that sort of thing indefinitely. So you're not planning for a big war. You're planning on being able to sustain smaller scale engagements indefinitely. And as a result, the whole army doesn't need to be fully equipped. You just need to have enough stuff around so that the guys who are going to Afghanistan can get everything they need. So there's no capacity, or there's no leeway, or no excess slack that would enable you to do an all hands on deck kind of thing. It's all designed to make the burden of deploying troops to Afghanistan as light as possible on the force, so that they're rotating through. You go to Afghanistan, you come back to Afghanistan, you have leave and R&R, and then you go back to school and you do training and all sorts of stuff. And then after, at some point, I think it was a 5-year cycle maybe, then you're up again for deployment, and then you go back to Afghanistan or wherever it is that you need to be sent. This, in a way, was a kind of like an ex post facto justification for skimping on equipment. So operational readiness for the German army throughout the 21st century, and probably even today, was very, very poor, because you didn't have enough stuff. So only a small portion of what they had, the Leopards, the whatever, were actually working, just because you didn't have enough pieces, you didn't have money to maintain everything. And so rather than deplore this situation, saying this is terrible, our readiness levels are terrible, we need to spend more money, what the Bundeswehr did was say, but this is deliberate, like this is a virtue, because we don't need to be fully operational. We just need to have enough stuff to maintain our few expeditionary deployments. So that was the approach. The Germans even toyed with a rotational equipping scheme. The idea is that, instead of like every unit having its own stuff, like its own trucks in the motor pool, its own tanks in the motor pool that they could use, rather it's all more or less centralized. And if you needed tanks to train your unit or to go to wherever, you could kind of check them out from the central repository. So the maintenance and everything was centralized, and it's just sort of rotational. This is, again, how to make the best use of having too few things. Germans have a cool term for this, so they just like this because I like the name, I like saying it, the dynamisches Verfügbarkeitsmanagement. I said that wrong. Dynamisches Verfügbarkeitsmanagement. It's really a mouthful. Or dynamic availability. By the way, the British and the French were doing the same thing at the same time, trying to use rotational equipping schemes to make up for the fact that they didn't want to spend enough money so that they would have enough stuff. The French called it like PFP or PJP or something, I don't know, and I don't remember the name of the British thing, whole equipment strategy, I don't remember. The justification for the partial equipping strategy is that you don't need to be fully equipped because you're not planning on having big wars. If you shift the priority towards big war, now it's very obvious you can't get away with this kind of approach. You have to spend the money so that all of your units are fully equipped so that you can get your readiness levels as high as you need them to be. And the 2026 document makes this very clear. It says very clearly, I think more than once, that the Bundeswehr will be fully equipped, even including reserve units. And the term of art is Vollausstattung, full equipping, which is something that earlier had been aspired to, but then rejected in favor of these partial rotational equipping schemes. Part 4, ambition, Germany as a military leader. Now, this is where things become really historically interesting and remarkable. Germany doesn't do military ambition, or at least I should say it hasn't since 1945, at least not openly. The entire post-war project was built around a Germany that was militarily capable, but strategically restrained. Germany contributes, Germany participates, Germany is a reliable, dependable, responsible partner, but Germany doesn't lead, Germany follows. Germany follows the Americans, Germany follows NATO. It does not aspire to any kind of military primacy. That's verboten. That's just not what Germany does. Now it is. And this document says, we are transforming the Bundeswehr into the strongest conventional army in Europe. Punkt. The strongest conventional army in Europe. This is really remarkable. It's the headline of the organizing concept for the entire force building agenda. And there's a whole chapter that's called exactly that lays out more or less, in admittedly vague terms, how they intend to do it. And then, of course, in the forward to this whole document by Defense Minister Pistorius, he says, the signal must be Germany is leading the way as a pacemaker among the European nations. Again, we compare this to the 2013 document, which described Germany as a shaping member of the international community. And the older stuff, the 2013 document, the 2016 white paper, it couched everything in very careful passive language. Germany was prepared to accept responsibility and assume leadership, but it's hedged, and it's all about partnership and doing everything in partnership, not taking the lead so that everybody else will follow. The 2026 document completely drops this. We are going to be the pacemakers. We're going to be the strongest in Europe. Germany is leading. Why the shift? The document is fairly explicit. It frames this in terms of Germany's relationship with the United States, the fact that America's attention is elsewhere, that America is kind of drifting away, which means that Germany has to step up to fill some of the void. I think that's the idea. It's all about now increasing Germany's strategic weight, and it's seen as this is necessary to do. Now, I do want to recall that the 2015 SVP document brief says very explicitly it warns against strategic overreach. It says that, like, look at your demographics, look at your equipment maintenance record, look at your procurement delays, and be honest about what Germany can actually deliver. This is a fair warning, and the warning is still valid. There's still a huge gap between ambition and capability. The 2026 document, the new one, acknowledges that this is going to have to be a phased approach here. Whatever we do moving forward is going to take a while, so we have to do it in phases. First, we're going to talk about boosting our short-term capability, and then medium-term broad capability improvements, and then long-term the Germans want to aim for technological superiority. Now, whether Germany can actually get there, whether the money is real, whether the procurement system can be fixed, whether you can build an army fast enough, these are questions that the document really can't answer, at least not in this unclassified version. What it does is simply set the direction, and I think the direction is very unambiguous, even if the details are left vague. Now, there's also an important institutional point here. This is not a white paper. White papers are government documents that require coalition compromise, ministerial sign-off across multiple departments, public consultation, etc. The result is a document that tends to smooth over contradictions and avoid uncomfortable choices. I see the 2026 Gezamtkonzeption as something that is, first of all, it's only coming out of the Ministry of Defense. It's a military document reflecting military logic. It makes choices. It makes priorities. It accepts trade-offs, and that's new for Germany. Part 5, the nature of war, what Ukraine changed, according to the Gezamtkonzeption. The final thing I want to talk about is the part of the document that I think is the most intellectually interesting and also the most practically consequential. It's the chapter on warfare. The previous German defense documents had almost nothing to say about how war is actually fought. The 2013 realignment document was all about reorganization. The 2016 white paper mentioned hybrid warfare and cyber attacks briefly. Neither engaged seriously with the question, what does modern warfare look like? The 2026 Gezamtkonzeption has an entire chapter on this. And it reads like something written by people who've done their homework and have spent a lot of time thinking about Ukraine. It identifies 6 key concepts that it says kind of define modern warfare. First, the dissolution of the boundaries of war. The state, the economy, the civilian populations, all these things are legitimate targets. The distinction between homeland and battlefield, that's gone. Between war and peace, that's gone. Between combatant and civilian, that's gone. All these are being deliberately erased. The document says bluntly, we can no longer rely on others to comply with the accepted ethical and legal principles, dividing between civilian and combatant civilian, and ultimately between war and peace. This is a significant admission. German strategic thought, German law was always placed a lot of weight on the laws of war, for obvious reasons, and the principle of civilian protection, for obvious reasons. The document isn't abandoning those principles, but it is acknowledging that the adversary doesn't care. The adversary doesn't share these principles, and German planning has to account for that. For those of you who've been following me for a while, hopefully you'll recognize as well some of, it should be reminiscent of French General André Boff's concept of peace-war, and his argument that post-Hiroshima, we are no longer ever fully at peace and unlikely to ever be fully at war. Everything now is in a gray zone. This is not to suggest that the Germans were reading Boff or reading me talking about Boff, but they probably just simply arrived at some similar conclusions independently. While I'm speaking of Boff, time for a shameless promotion. I did write, I've been spending several years now reading in-depth French strategic thinking, and what I did is I recently published via Amazon like a distillation, a brief distillation and introduction of some of the highlights and the most interesting bits that you're going to find reading modern French military strategy. It's called The French Way of War, 8 Strategy Lessons for Today's Conflicts. This is available on Amazon and Amazon internationally in English, and I also translated it recently into French. So you can get this document both in English and in French, both in a paperback version and in Kindle. Enough with the shameless plug. Now let's get back to it. Second, so the second theme that the Germans identified here in terms of like what they saw in the Ukraine war is what they call multi-temporal war. This concept is really worth pausing over. The idea is that modern warfare isn't characterized by one technology level, it's characterized by all of them simultaneously. So you've got quantum computing and robots, which exist at the same time on the battlefield as artillery shells and trenches. You've got cutting-edge sensor fusion, which is used alongside Soviet-era infantry tactics. The adversary combines high-tech and low-tech, not because they haven't modernized, but because it's a deliberate strategy. It just works. The third theme that the Germans see is what they call the transparent battlefield. The data has become a weapon. AI-enabled sensor networks, commercial satellites, FPV drones, networked ISR systems. All this means that concealment is increasingly difficult. The document says that even today, quote, it is difficult to avoid being targeted by real-time reconnaissance. Information superiority is no longer a permanent advantage you establish once. It has to be fought for continuously for specific areas and specific windows of time. This has profound implications for how you design an army. If your position is visible the moment you concentrate forces, you have to think very differently about movement, dispersion, deception, and the speed at which you can act on your own intelligence before the enemy acts on theirs. 4. Strategic standoff effects. Precision long-range weapons in all ranges mean that there are no safe rare areas. The document puts it simply, quote, there are no safe havens, unquote. This applies to logistics nodes, command posts, repair facilities, air bases. Everything within ranges is targetable, and the ranges keep increasing. 5. Automation and automation. AI and unmanned systems are increasingly central to warfare. The document makes an uncomfortable but honest observation. The adversary will exploit these technologies without restraint. Germany will have to grapple with its own ethical and legal constraints on autonomous systems, but it cannot afford to be so far behind that those constraints become a decisive disadvantage. It's going to be tricky. You can't be too limited by your own rules of engagement when you're dealing with an adversary that has none and couldn't care less. But that doesn't mean you have to throw principle completely out, the baby out with the bathwater. You've got to find some sort of compromise, but the compromise is obviously going to be very difficult to establish. This is something that all Western militaries are grappling with now. 6, scale. This is an economics of war question, and it's one that post-war Germany is, I think, the least prepared for. The Germans, like us Americans, we don't like mass-producing cheap systems. It's more about exquisite things, exquisite systems that are very expensive. So German weapon systems, the armored vehicles, the Leopards, the self-propelled howitzers, these are very expensive. They're high-end, they're fabulous, they're super expensive. But it's kind of a problem because also if you've got technologically superior but numerically inferior, numerically limited forces, you're going to be in trouble if your adversary can produce 1,000 cheap drones for every one of your expensive air defense interceptors. The math eventually goes the wrong way. So the document calls this quantity as quality, and it says that explicitly that Germany needs a, quote, balanced mix of high-tech systems, existing systems, and low-cost mass-produced technologies. In other words, stop betting everything on exquisite, expensive, low-quantity platforms. You got to build some mass. This, of course, is a lesson that I think NATO has been struggling with and slow to learn. The assumption forever has been that Western technological superiority would compensate for inferior numbers vis-a-vis the East, vis-a-vis the Soviets and the Warsaw Pact. Ukraine has greatly complicated this assumption and underscored the importance of mass. Sometimes mass actually matters. So the trick is to try to put together some kind of high-low mix. You can't only have a lot of low-tech stuff. You can't only have high-tech stuff. You've got to have some sort of mix, but figuring out what the correct mix is, that's very difficult. Now, let me put this all together. The 2026 Gezamtkonzeption is, in my reading, a genuine strategic rupture, not an incremental update. It does 4 things that the earlier documents don't do. It names an adversary, Russia. It declares a priority mission, Russia. It sets an ambitious strategic goal, which is to have the strongest conventional army in Europe, and with Germany as a pacemaker. No hedges, no partnership, nothing like that. And it engages seriously with the nature of modern warfare. Transparent battlefield, multi-temporal conflict, the economics of attrition. This is a document that has done its homework on Ukraine. Whether Germany can actually deliver on all of this, right, whether that Zeitenwende, the turning point announced in February 22, will ever translate into real capability, that is a separate and altogether different question. There are so many problems with the Bundeswehr, the way it operates, the procurement system, personnel challenges, and issues with the industrial base. It has troubles doing things at scale. You need a lot of political will to sustain a lot of defense spending across multiple budget cycles. All of this remains to be seen. Can they actually do it? Still, the document does tell you something really important. It tells you that Germany, these people responsible for the Bundeswehr, understand, I think, the strategic situation. It's like they're finally getting it. And understanding that their role in Europe matters, and given Germany's size and wealth, they really kind of have no choice but to try to take a leadership role, because they can afford better than anyone else the kind of strategic conventional capabilities that Europe requires. If you found this interesting and useful, please hit like and subscribe, leave a comment. I'm particularly curious about whether or not you think Germany can actually meet this ambition, or whether this is just aspirational language that's going to run into the usual bureaucratic inertia and political constraints. So let me know what you think. Also in the description, you're going to find links to my social media, my Twitter, my Blue Sky, my LinkedIn, and my own website, michaelshirkin.com. Plus, I have a Substack, also called Pax Americana, that I try to write for about once a week. Please stay tuned. There's plenty more coming in the pipeline.